I invite Steve Lonn to attempt to reclaim all of our brains from the sugar high. Steve is the Director of Data Analytics and Research at Enrollment Management, and I'm really excited to hear him talk about the demographic changes we should be expecting in the future.
All right, thanks, Kate. So this talk came from a chat Kate and I were having back in December, and I'm like, oh yeah, like you read all the stuff in the Chronicle about the coming enrollment cliff. She's like, what? What are you talking about? So these are things that we've been talking about a lot in the Office of Enrollment Management. And I've never given this talk before publicly, so this will be fun. The nice part about this is that all the data I'm going to show is all publicly available data. These are things that you can go, you can download and start playing with, and we'd love to, if you start playing with it more, we'd love to hear what you find. So there are a lot of factors affecting U.S. higher education enrollment. Things that you do read about in the news just about every day, about value, tuition, and attendance, and compulsory credentials, and global and online footprints, recruitment practices. We want to tell a lot about this thing in the bottom right here, about changing demographics and population. What is happening in this space? So one of the nice things we know, and this comes from National Center for Health Statistics, out of the CDC, that we know generally how many births that happen in the U.S. every year. And there's this peak that happened in 2007 that you see on top there, and then it's kind of fallen with the recession. People are just not having as many kids anymore. I did my job, I had 2, but my parents had 3, so there's a difference there. And we see that going all the way up to 2018, that the number of births has really fallen off, over 10% since that high in 2007 before the recession. So what does this mean? Right now, we're in the circle. So these are the folks that traditional age, they're about 17, 18 years old, they just enrolled last fall. So we are still coming up to the peak, right? So enrollment should be keeping going up, and then, what's going to happen then? So this is starting to look at what's going on. But we see differences by region. So the orange you see there on the top is actually the South, so all the southern states, and then followed by the western states. We're over here in the Midwest, we're kind of that blue place where, yes, there's kind of that kind of like ish peak around 2007, but it's pretty flat. So not as much of a steep peak as you saw with the overall demographics, and then the Northeast is even lower than us. So when you think about even Michigan, where are we in that space? So we're the third most populous state in the Midwest, followed by Illinois and Ohio, but we don't have a peak. It's just been going down since 1995. Okay. Yeah, this is a little scary, all right? So this is when you think about, we have 14 public institutions in the state, there's a few private institutions in the state. What does this mean in terms of the majority of our students that come from the state of Michigan? What does this mean? And what does this mean for all institutions in the state, as well as the region? So there's other sources of children, right? We college, it's not just U.S. born, they're all from the area. So there's other movement, right? What's interesting is that foreign-born child population, so you're talking about first-generation immigrants, has consistently averaged around 4%, at least as long as we can track through 2017. And this is from this organization called childtrends.org, where they kind of keep track of this stuff. So overall, that population has been pretty consistent. So it's not a majority of, or even a growth or decline, at least so far we can measure. Although we only have kind of 1-year measurement under the current presidential administration in that data so far. State-to-state migration is also interesting. So this comes from the American Community Survey out of the census, and that's a really great way to kind of figure out where migration patterns are happening. Not surprisingly, for those of you who kind of follow the economy, a lot of the jobs are moving to the south and the west. So approximately 7.5 million people moved to a different state last year in 2 years ago. I guess we're now in 2020. So Florida, Texas, and California being major beneficiaries of that. They each had over 500,000 people move to that state. Here in Michigan, people are like, oh, the economy maybe is recovering. It's good. People are moving to the state. Yeah, yes, and more, that's increasing. So 139,000 people didn't move to Michigan, but 153,000 also left. which is a 14,000 net loss. So on top of the birth rate declines, we're also having still more people leave the state and usually taking their families with them. So what does that all mean? So there are two really good sources of data that in higher ed we've been using the last few years. So WISHE, or this is the Western Interstate Commission in Higher Education, we just call it WISHE. They've run this report now for several years, different versions of it. Is knocking at the college door. Let's show some of those projections here in a minute. And then Nathan Graw is a professor at Carleton, and he has taken the WISHE data and then applied additional predictive analytics to it and really talked about how does that data show the demographic shifts. So bringing together census and the graduation predictions as well as some other factors, and really thinking about what does this mean as higher ed starts planning for the next decade and beyond. So this is, majority of what we're going to talk about today is the WISHE data. So you can see that they have actual numbers in their recent report all the way through about 2011, and then they have projections moving on from there using the birth rate data and other sources. So you can see that actually overall they're predicting a growth, because you see that peak from 2007, the birth rate, that correlates to that peak in 3.6 million, and then there's the cliff. So right there on the right there, that it doesn't look that steep because you're in a graph here of millions, and there is no zero on the left. So stretched my thing, but that actually is equates to several thousands of students that may or may not now be showing up for higher education. So what does this mean on a national scope, right? So let's take the country at large. So if you're in the Northeast, you've been feeling this pain for a while already. So this is the prediction change up through 2025. So you hear about, I was just talking with some colleagues during the break, that I have a colleague at University of Delaware, and they're already at about 70% out of state in their enrollment, because there's just not enough high school graduates within the state to really bring it in. So they are drawing from other places, kind of the New England area. But that's something, and obviously we're feeling it in Michigan and Ohio. Overall, the nation will be increasing at that point, still for high school graduates, almost 5%. And then the 5 years after that is when we start seeing that cliff, and things start to shift quite a bit. So you're seeing that a lot more blue happen throughout the Midwest. The South kind of stabilizes, so they're kind of within that plus or minus 5% as far as we can tell. California actually starts to decrease, while the other Western states either gaining slightly or staying constant. Texas continues to increase, but the nation overall will decline with high school grads about 4% because of that cliff that we saw. So what does that mean in Michigan? So the nice thing about the WISHE data is you can go in there. They have dashboards. They have data showing you their projections for every single state, so you can really dig in. So we saw our peak in 2007 for high school grads, and they're projecting that we will end up with around 88,000 overall public and private high school grads, around 85K. Private school graduates, it's about a 25% decline, which is not insignificant. So what does that mean? How do we plan for this? But there's some also interesting trends that we're seeing within that data. So while the overall population is declining, there are gains in other areas. So actually what we're seeing is with the rest of the demographics of the country, we're also seeing the high school grads emerging, and kind of, the gap between white and non-white high school grads is actually closing overall. That we're getting more Hispanic, more Black, more other populations who are actually going to become high school grads despite the declines that you see. This is interesting. So this is taking every year's change and kind of averaging it over time. This goes through 2025. So this, and then looking by region. So Midwest is on the left there. then followed by Northeast, South, and West. So you can see South continues to gain, but the gains are all in non-white populations. So the kind of red on top there is Asian. The big blocks are Hispanic. So across the board, we're seeing gains in Hispanic populations. The gray bars are actually white folks. So obviously in the Northeast and the Midwest, we see declines. They're predicting average year-over-year declines in the South and West. Pretty small percentage-wise, but again, this is increases in diverse populations. With this also means that we're going to see increases in first-generation students, in more diverse incomes, more low-income folks as well. So the actual demographics of those populations are changing. So there's a lot of numbers. I think we're sharing the slides so you can take into these more on yourself. But this is some of Graw's work that I wanted to share. So according to Graw, we're in the west and east, so middle of the country, but we're the north central. I think there's just a lot of directional stuff in there. That's where we are. We're in that section. What's interesting is we're in a privileged spot here, right? So we're all the way over the right here. University of Michigan, Ann Arbor campus is on the right side, so elite institution. But the predictions are showing is a projected percent change from 2015 by 2025 is 36% more underrepresented minority students. Slightly less 5 years later with all the declines everywhere and the graduation and the birth rate kind of finally hitting that cliff. But what does this mean that we're in this nice privileged spot where, we're the flagship, we have lots of demand. You hear about us every year, we talk about we got more and more apps. But what is it going to mean that we're going to start talking about the out-of-state applications are going to continue probably to increase given the population you saw, but in-state applications are actually, we're already starting to see a decrease. That will continue. And what does it mean that we support, we're part of a region, we have 2 regional campuses, they're part of the brand of Michigan, there's Dearborn and Flint. What does that mean for them in this space? What does that mean for other public institutions in the state? Well, how does that affect us? How will that support, the just conversation in the state when there might be more impacts to them about as enrollment shifts? So, and there's Nathan Graw, so you can see his quote there. And this is hard, right? So you talk to the regions, we talk to our institutional leadership that we don't deal with paradigm shifts. That despite that, I can show you guys the cliff, right? It's coming. That it has already happened. The birth rate has fallen in the country, and those students are going to progress through high school. But we're predisposed to seek status quo solutions. So these are things, and this is definitely not everything, but this is questions about demographic balance, questions about international demand, and are we relying on that international demand for enrollment? Competition for students is going to increase between institutions. Retention efforts, what does it mean to actually work more closely with faculty? So you fight for these students to enroll. Are we going to be that much more cognizant, and how do we actually retain them, make sure they're successful? And then state and federal funding is also going to have impacts to the point that there's some discussion of could the legislature come to a state, to institutions and say, okay, there's not enough demand, there's not as many students in your state, so we're going to offer 4 nursing schools across the state. They're going to be in these regional spots, and that's it. So those are different things we're looking at. And this data is all available, so you can go poke in yourself. So thank you. Any questions? So all down to press. Yes, sir.
Is the high school graduation rate simply a number that reflects the birth rate, or does it include the percentages for state for how many high school kids actually end up leaving high school?
Right, so it's a combination of all those. So it's the birth rate combined with the migration rate combined with looking at high schools and retention through high school, so keeping kind of the dropout rates into account. So lots of different variables going in.
Doing with high school graduation rates?
Our high school graduation rate in the States has actually been going up slightly. So I think it's, I want to say in the low 80s overall, but I could be wrong.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Has there been any consideration in looking at enrollment rates on non-traditional learners, so not looking at the high school demographic, but folks who maybe are returning or who are trying to complete?
Nationally, yes. So the question is about non-traditional students, non-traditional age. So nationally, this is very much part of the conversation, and especially in our transfer population, we see much more kind of non-traditional age. Our entering students are still very traditional, but I think with the decline in population in the state, that might be something we look at and saying, like, you know, do we talk more to non-traditional learners? What would that mean for instruction at the university? So lots of different variables at play. Great question.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.